Fire Coaches Podcasts, unique episode here. I think we've only had one baseball guest in the past 50 some plus episodes. Tonight, the previous episode, we actually talked about football scouting. And tonight, joined by Mark Ralston, who spent nearly 30 years in Major League Baseball scouting world. We'll kind of dive into his story, but he spent time with the Braves, the Mets over multiple stints, the Phillies, the Orioles, from the Los Angeles area, and really look forward to kind of hearing his story. Obviously, what he learned, stories he's seen. I kind of joked with him on the phone last night when we were kind of just kind of introing each other a little bit. That I think you should probably write a book because there's probably some really good stories from over the past summers and things like that, and events that he's tended and games and everything like that. So, Mark, really appreciate you, kind of connected with you on LinkedIn, and appreciate you joining tonight.
Yeah, my pleasure, Marcus. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome. So I guess you went to San Diego State, correct?
I did go to San Diego State, yes.
Okay, so at your time going to San Diego State and then kind of doing that intro apprenticeship type thing with the Atlanta Braves, what kind of transpired from there, from you being in school to kind of figuring out like, hey, this is maybe a route I can go?
Well, my introduction into scouting was very unique, and it actually even started prior to my attending San Diego State. It started the summer after my junior year in high school. I had a subscription to Sports Illustrated, and there was a brief article in there on a book on scouting called Dollar Sign on the Muscle. And I read that article, and my dad was a football coach. I was playing football, basketball, and baseball. But that article really kind of caught my imagination. I'd been with my dad to games scouting opponents and that sort of thing. But just the idea of going out and evaluating players and the lifestyle that was kind of portrayed in that book caught my imagination. So I asked my dad for the car keys, and he said, "Well, what for?" I said, "Well, I need to go to Borders and get a book." And he says, "You're going to go get a book." He says, "I want to see this." So he drove me to Borders, and I picked up Dollar Sign on the Muscle and read through it. And I probably read that book 3 times in about 2 weeks and set it down. And I happened to be at an appointment of my family doctor had helped deliver me, and, old school family doctor. And he had asked what I wanted to be if I'd given any thought. And I said, I just blurted out, I want to be a baseball scout. And he said, well, funny enough, I have 2 patients that are baseball scouts. And a gentleman named Roger Youngward happened to be in the office one of the days my dad was in there. And Dr. Jones introduced Dean, I'm sorry, not Roger, Dean Youngward. And it turned out Dean lived a couple miles from where we lived, and I met him for breakfast. And I said, I love baseball. I like to play, but I know I'm not going to play at UCLA or Arizona State or play in the major leagues. And I appreciate some of your time. And looking back on it, having been in the position for 23 years over the last 33 years, I recognize how special and unique it was a situation for him to take the time that he took with me. And I kind of started meeting him on Saturday mornings and riding along and going to high school tournament games and college games. And I worked for him as an apprentice, basically bird dog, we called it, for a couple years before I went to San Diego State and got my first part-time job with the Mets covering San Diego County when I was with the, going to school at San Diego State. So it was a heck of a part-time job as a college student. I had a lot of people, they were wondering why I was getting all these letters, with New York Mets stationery arriving at the dorms. And what was behind that was, at that time, there's no internet. There was really no way to access college, junior college, or high school schedules other than contacting the schools. So you'd write to the coach or the athletic director and request their schedules. So, the guy that ran the dorm, that particular dorm, the dorm manager, was kind of wondering why, there were 75, 100 letters addressed to me, all with New York Mets stationery on them, as a college junior at San Diego State. So it was a topic of a lot of conversation among my peers.
That is wild. In your time, and this is probably a little bit of a loaded question, but in your time, have you met anybody else that started that young?
I haven't, and most other people haven't either. There's, been some talk that some other people started young, but, I was just a little bit older than 22 when Bob Miner hired me full time with the New York Mets. I thought I was on top of the world. I had an apartment, I had a per diem and mileage, and I was driving all over, at that time, Los Angeles and a little bit of Central California. I was living the dream as far as I was concerned as a 22 going on 23-year-old.
Yeah, you probably thought you were the GM of the Mets, right? At that age, you're like, "Holy cow, this is unbelievable." Talking about kind of reaching out to the schools and things like that for schedules. I mean, at that time, I'm assuming Baseball America stuff was around, right? But they weren't really probably covering much of like the minor leagues or anything. Was there anything that you were able to, was there any like independent people that were trying to cover it? I mean, again, I know we're talking pre-internet, but was there any not publications, but just anybody that was out there that you could call and get a feeling on, or literally did you just have to go out there and literally see it for yourself?
Initially, it was just going out and seeing it for myself. Over time, at some point in time during the first year, especially in Central California, when I got up there, there was a group of older scouts and some guys that had scouted for a long time that were part-time that took a liking to me. And, there would be some, early on, I learned, to keep my eyes and ears open and my mouth shut. And, that approach gained me some respect of a lot of my older peers. I wouldn't even say peers, but colleagues. And they would come and say, hey, you might want to see this kid at Fresno City College, or hey, this event's going on. And then over time, I developed my own networks. I had bird dogs of my own. I had a part-time guy that we hired, named call him Bump, but James Merriweather, who's gone on to be, a national cross checker with the Diamondbacks. So you end up developing your own network, guys that kind of officially work with you, and people that unofficially that you can call, knowledgeable coaches that you can say, hey, are there anybody at this school? I heard this name. Yeah, you need to go see him. No, you don't. So, but that point in time, no cell phones, no internet. It was a lot of word of mouth and legwork on the phone and talking to people. Being at the ballpark has always been something that you just end up hearing stuff at the ballpark that you don't come across any other way, whether it be a game, whether it be a pitching change, whether it be, something about somebody's character. I rarely can say that I left the ballpark without gaining something that helped me in my job, even if the player or team that I was there to see didn't have much to offer prospect wise. Usually walked away with something where I thought, man, yeah, I'm glad I was here to see that or hear that.
Absolutely. Was there, and then this is, old college basketball ways of things, but would you guys ever, and maybe again, you just kind of touched on this in terms of contacting people and developing relationships, but was there ever any point in time where you would send people that you trusted, like every spring or every, upcoming year of something of like, hey, here's a reminder of like, hey, is there anybody that you know within your league, in your division, your district, whatever that is, of names? Or was it literally just like, I just got to call that person or literally go see them at their game and touch base with them this year to kind of get those names and kind of pick their brain on who might be out there?
Yeah, actually, even on the schedule request, we had a section on there, asking for recommendation of players that they coached or even in the league. And, that did help where you could start to identify who was recommending the right guys and who, maybe didn't have a great feel for their recommendations. For example, there was a coach, Ed Olson, who was very successful at Grossmont Junior College. He'd been a minor league player and coach. And so he was somebody, that I would go and say, Ed, seen anybody? What do you think? And over the years, developed a relationship with him. In the early days, it's just a lot of time getting in the car, a lot of time on bleachers. One of the things that we would do is, if you're going to see, say, San Diego State and you're there to see maybe a junior shortstop and they have a freshman right fielder, we would accumulate what we call follow lists. So you'd make a note of a person to come back and see for following years. And that was really important with the high schools that you make note of an underclassman that was interesting, that had something that caught your eye, and to be on the lookout for them in the summertime. At that time it was American Legion. There were no showcases. It was American Legion ball tournaments. Palomino was big in San Diego, but it was a lot of time in the ballpark and accumulating names and seeing guys. And then you come back and you run across them in 12 months and you go, wow, this guy's grown, or this guy's improved this and that. I need to keep tabs on this person until the summer before his senior year, when you really start diving in and scrutinizing guys.
Yeah, sure. I was going to ask you actually about those showcases, but that makes sense that hadn't come about at that point yet. In terms of those early years, you getting into it, looking back now, what mistakes did you make? What things did you maybe do really well that you're like, hey, I was kind of ahead of the curve for being maybe a younger guy and just having a good feel because you got started at such a young age, being able to see what it was like to scout.
Wow, that's a great question. I would say that probably the thing that took me a while to recognize was when I had kind of a gut feel on somebody, or I had, kind of in, I don't want to say intuition, but my instinct said, yeah, this particular player. And to be able to stick with that when something came up to the contrary and remember that and not talk myself off of a guy that I had seen something that caught my eye, or, as Joe McIlvaine used to say, had crossed my line. The mistakes that I had made were, I kind of moved the line on them. They'd crossed my line. I'd seen what I'd liked. And then, well, I better go back and see one more time and just make sure. And then, the doubt and talk myself off of them, so to speak. So that took a long time to learn. And I think that's, from guys I've trained and guys colleagues I've been around, friends, that's something that's common. It takes a while to get that confidence that you saw what you saw and you're sticking with it.
Yeah, no doubt. What made you make that jump from obviously the Mets giving you that true full-time first opportunity from 90 to 95? What made you take that jump to the Phillies from 95 to 99?
Well, my mentor Dean had moved from the Braves to being the West Coast supervisor with the Phillies, and they had let their area guy go, and so he had called and said, "We have this opening, and I'd like to have you bring you over." And it was a lateral move, but that was not uncommon at that point in time. So I had moved to the Phillies, had company cars, and there was a bump in pay that at that point in time, was in 25 or 26, whatever it was, it sounded like, it was very significant to me at the time. I look back on it now and kind of laugh at it. But at the time, I went, geez, I'm getting a $5,000 raise. This is the greatest thing ever. So,
Right.
yeah. And, it was important. It was a good move for me professionally. It was good to be back with Dean, who had always been really good with me. To this day, he's probably one of, if not the best evaluator I've ever been around. So a large amount of my professional success came with him. And, we butted heads a little bit sometimes. I could always play the card with him if he disagreed with me. Well, you trained me. You said you taught me everything I knew. This is your fault. And, that didn't always go over well, but we always smooth things out. And, it led to us getting a couple pretty good players in a couple instances.
What made him so good?
Well, he was trained. His brother Roger ended up being the scouting director with Seattle when they took King Griffey Jr. and had a lot of success. It all started with a man named Harry Minor with the Mets, who was actually the Mets Scout of the Year award is now named after Harry. And Harry had trained Dean's brother Roger. Roger trained Dean, and obviously Dean trained myself. But he just had the ability to identify things quickly, and he didn't have to see a player show him the ability to know it was there.
Interesting.
And
So he could really see through things then.
he could really see through things. He just had you know, uh, a really good feel. He was a very good evaluator in terms of the physical things, the swings, the mechanics, those sorts of things. But he had the knack to kind of see down the road and see what was coming, even if he didn't necessarily wasn't seeing it at the time. One of the things when I first started with him, he had drafted Robbie Nin when he was with the Rangers, and Nin didn't throw very hard at the time. And then the velocity came on at the end of the summer, and they signed him, and he ended up being one of the premier relievers in the big leagues for a while. And he saw that future velocity in him when he was still 5, 6, 7 miles an hour from what he ended up throwing in the major leagues. So he was looking back, I've met a lot of good people, got to spend a lot of time around some really good people, but I was really fortunate to be mentored by Dean.
Yeah, absolutely. What in terms of the scouting realm, you're just talking about hitting and talking about velocity with pitching. And I know there's, like any sport and any specific, position there's we could spend 8 to 15 hours talking about positions and probably everything you're looking for. But from a hitting standpoint and a pitching standpoint, I guess you could throw a fielding standpoint in there. How different is it, or how similar can it be in terms of like things you're looking for, or is it truly all, kind of unique on its own?
Well, there are definitely some similarities. I mean, you start with athletic ability and body movements and the type of movers that guys are. the best athletes, especially at the high school level, they tend to be the shortstop, they tend to be the center fielder, they're probably gonna pitch as well too. So that's one of the things that you would do as part of your daily work is not only get to the game early, but get there early to watch warm-ups. California, they don't take batting practice before the games, but if you have the opportunity to see batting practice, to see guys catch, play catch, even to warm up, teams usually take we call infield and outfield practice, and that's valuable to see some of the tools, arm strength and quickness and body control. But you really just kind of start with athletic body types and athletic movements and go from there. And the old school guys had a phrase too. They called it having a good face. And it wasn't necessarily having to do with, the guy being handsome or any sort of facial features, which, a lot of times they were, but they just kind of had this look and this way of moving to them. There was a quiet confidence. There's just kind of, some guys later on kind of turned into the it factor type of thing.
Like an
But
alpha kind of thing, right? Where you're
an
like,
alpha kind of thing, yeah, you just over time, you learn your eyes gravitate towards, "Okay, that guy right there, I need to pay a little bit more attention to than these other 7 or 8 guys." And sometimes the 7 or 8th guy, will impress you. They'll do something that catches your eye, but usually that guy that, you can kinda go, that's an athlete. Let's see if he's a baseball prospect."
yeah, no doubt. Before we jump to the Orioles, where obviously you spent a lot of your time with, what's always enamored me in like I told you on the phone last night, worked 3 summers in summer baseball, one in minor league, and two of which in college summer ball. And really my college summer ball experience from 2000 to, or excuse me, from 2018 to 2021 was, in the Northwoods League and seeing a bunch of these guys that are now actually making the major leagues now and having an impact. Caleb Durbin, who's with the Brewers, and, he came from Fond du Lac. And what really impressed me was like, the scouts that would come out. And I'm just thinking between, the junior college guys, the high school guys, the 3-year college guys, just all these guys like, and obviously I know you had a specific kind of territory and stuff like that, but how does an organization go about taking the masses and really figuring out, or to an outsider, is it really seem like masses, but in the inner circles, it's actually not as many as one would think in terms of being able to draft what you would think is anybody, right? With all those different areas, as opposed to a football, an NFL, or an NBA with basketball. Or is it more so like, no, actually in the inner rooms, like we know that there's this high level high school kid in such and such that, if he's not taken in this round here, he's maybe going to go and play college ball. Like, I guess from an outsider perspective, is that pretty common where everyone knows what's going on the inside, or is it a little bit different when you get inside and really nobody else knows who's going to take who?
Well, it's really a big funnel. And as an area scout, you'll start off with, your follow list like we talked about. I mean, it's definitely changed over the years with showcases and some of the teams and things that are happening nowadays. There tends to be a little bit more concentration of some of the better players than there used to be. I mean, when I first started out, I mean, we did what do we call coverage. So Dean was responsible for the area. He had myself, he had a part-time scout and another gentleman like ourselves. And we used to have pizza meetings every 2 weeks where we'd go over and I'd say, I saw Kennedy High School, there's no one there. I saw La Quinta High School,
You're
there's
kind
a
of like
soft
checking off your box almost.
checking off your boxes. And so, that big funnel then goes to the area guy. The area guy sifts through and, eliminates, writes reports on guys that he thinks are prospects at a certain level. In comes a regional supervisor, the West Coast supervisor, which is ultimately what Dean's role, and the national cross checker. So the regional supervisor will come in and see a certain number, all the players that are a certain evaluation or grade or above. And then you have national supervisors, national cross checkers, that sort of thing. Nowadays, it's with so many showcases, and you have things like, the perfect game, all American games. You have things where a lot of these high profile guys are being seen by a lot of people, a lot of the directors, the cross checker levels throughout the summer. There's a lot of familiarity with those guys, and there's a lot of events and teams to see those guys play on. As an area guy, I always felt like, especially in an area like Southern California, where there were so many kids playing, that the hitters usually stood out. You could get an idea of pretty early on that this guy is somebody that has a chance to hit. I need to get more games. I need to get more at bats to say make my proper evaluation on them. The pitching, I always used to say, you could take 15 or 20 kids in Southern California that were throwing 86, 89 miles an hour in September, October. They were 6'2" or 6'3", and two of those guys were going to be throwing 93, 94 in the spring. So the name of the game was getting to those guys early enough, hearing about it, seeing it yourself, to get your supervisor and your cross checkers to come in and see those type of guys. And I mean, a Brad Boxberger, I can't think of Cahill's last name, that was at Vista High School. Anyways, those are kids that you saw in the summertime that maybe were shortstops and ended up coming on and being higher picks. Cahill was the second round pick. Well, in the summertime, you would not have thought that was he was going to go in that realm of the draft. So nowadays, it's a little bit more, people have a little bit more knowledge of who the best guys are going to be. There's a lot of views of those guys. There's a lot of information and data on those guys from all the events that they play at in the summertime. But there's still room for somebody, to come on a little bit, late maturing type of kid. And, as an area guy, those guys are some of the guys that are a little bit fun, to be able to say, hey, this guy's come on. I like him because of these reasons, and to get your bosses in and feel like you have a chance at acquiring one of those guys in the draft.
So you still feel like, again, guys developing late, guys can kind of fall under the radar at times, if people aren't doing their due diligence kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's not so much fall under the radar, is just they end up, they're late bloomers. A kid doesn't throw really well in high school or comes on late in high school, ends up in junior college, or, I'm not real well versed in the college recruiting world, but a lot from what I understand, those guys are giving out a lot of scholarships early on, and somebody may come on late and they end up at a smaller school or they go to a junior college, and, they're definitely still those guys. And with the 20-round draft and the reduction in the minor league teams, there's probably not as many opportunities to sign some of those players and send them out and give them an opportunity. But you're kind of starting the information gathering. You're starting the history on those guys. If you filed a report and you end up liking those guys a year or two down the road, you have some history that's documented to be able to say, hey, I saw this guy in high school and here's what he was. I saw this guy as a freshman in junior college. Here's what he was. And now here's the second big jump in velocity. And he's
Yeah.
got the pitches now. He's got the things that we're looking for. It's not as long a projection. There's not as big a risk. You're not looking so far down the road.
Yeah, you got more of a story to them, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Could you explain, just before we touch on the Orioles, I always thought with baseball too, very interesting with the cross checkers, just because I think that's a little bit more unique to baseball as opposed to when you think of, football, regional scouts or guys that are in certain areas, and things like that. Could you explain kind of the process of what a national cross checker does?
So obviously now with computers, they're able to access the lists, the reports really easily. The player schedules are going to be in a program that has their schedules. Usually those guys will be working parts of the country. So your national cross checker may come to Southern California, spend 4 or 5 days, and they say, okay, we want to see, Smith, we want to see Jones, I want to see, Richards. And then you can kind of fill in around those guys that they're looking at that are going to be the very, what we consider, maybe different organizations do it differently. Some guys, it'll be just first round considerations. Other, it'll be top 3 or top 4 round considerations. And then you have the opportunity, if it's a college guy, maybe at UCLA, and you're there to see the shortstop, and you say, well, I also have reports filed on, the center fielder, the right fielder, the third baseman. There's a couple relief pitchers we might see. So they end up filling in on some guys that they may not be there to see specifically, but the information is all available. You have coordinators in the department that are saying, we have good reports from the area guys. We have analytics and data that supports this. We've got a lot of information. We want to make sure that we get you in and get your evaluations on that. And it's kind of a steady stream nowadays. There's multiple people that'll be getting multiple looks at those guys.
That's awesome. Appreciate your kind of going over that.
Good.
So 04 to 19, you're with the Orioles. Is there, and as we're talking about the Orioles and as you're in the scouting community for this long time, the previous episode we had Neil Stratton on, who runs Inside the League, which is a kind of a football type of program that helps with agents, scouting world, really kind of giving them tools and access to different events that are out there and kind of like creates a little community. And when I was talking with Neil, he wrote a book that basically said how in the scouting world of football, one would think on the outside that these guys are very proprietary. You're not going to get my information. I'm working here. But he's like, actually, in the football world, you would find it funny how, and I'll use in baseball, for example, like the Orioles scout, if he sees the Phillies scout in his area quite a bit, he's actually going to talk to him a little bit because maybe down the road that guy will end up getting a job and he wants to become friends with him and kind of maybe get promoted. Like, is the baseball world is a little bit more closed off, or is there certain relationships where you see guys from other organizations and you're like, well, hey, I've seen this guy on the road for 10, 12 years. We stay in some of the same hotels or same areas just because we're by each other. Is that relationships kind of tight, or is that more fewer than you would kind of think?
No, it's very similar. You end up seeing a lot of the similar guys at the same games you're going to. You find out that there's scouts from other teams that kind of see things the way or similar to the way that you do. You find 4 or 5 days a week you're at the similar games, seeing the same players. There's some guys you see it a little bit less. They may not like the player, their team may not be, a demographic nowadays that isn't highly sought after is the high school right-handed pitcher. So if you're going to see, say a mid-draft somebody that might be a 6 to 10 range high school pitcher, you get an idea which guys might be there. And if you don't see certain teams there, you're like, okay, well, this is just not a demographic they're going to be involved in. But yeah, it's very, there's some guys that you're very, friendly with, people that you get close to. Rarely do you give away, very rarely would you give away grades or an evaluation, but there's guys that you get to be friends with that you don't want to see get burned and say, hey, if you haven't seen Jones over there, I want to take a look. You know, and that's one of the ways, as Neil said, it's interesting. I subscribe to Neil's newsletter, so I'm
Yeah.
familiar with his work. He does a great job, very informative. You do get to know guys, and as they move to other organizations or move up, you hope that those relationships and those sorts of things, may pay off down the road and that sort of thing. But I don't know if there's so much, if it's gamed out that way. Is it just when you're on the road? Southern California is a little bit different because there weren't a lot of overnight trips. There's a lot of
Sure.
to the game and drive home. But, you end up with guys before the game, batting practice, watching the field get watered and prepared and shooting the breeze. And obviously there's guys you get a lot closer to than others. But yeah, it is very similar. And as more and more stuff is ended up on the internet, as more and more stuff is publicized in a lot of these showcases and major events, it seems like a little bit more information is being shared now than maybe there was 15, 20 years ago when you felt like you had a chance to beat people with some proprietary information or have somebody hit out. That was a lot of fun. There was some gamesmanship that was played in those days too that probably doesn't go on.
I believe that goes back to that book with some of those stories. Orioles 2004, 2019, post Cal Ripken era. I think Cal were retired in 2001. We were there 15 years. So what, I mean, really, what was that time like? Working for the Orioles, and I mean, again, 15 years is a long time to be with any organization, in any type of role. So, what was that kind of experience like for you?
Overall, it was a good experience. The scouting department was an excellent department to be in. Joe Jordan was the scouting director who hired me and brought me over, and we had a good run hit with him. And then when Dan Duquette took over as vice president and general manager, he brought in a man, Gary Racich, who had been a former major leaguer, and both those guys were great guys to work with. It was a good department. We had some really good scouts. We got along well. You could speak honestly. It was easy to tell people, hey, I like this guy, and here's the reasons why. I felt I was respected and heard to the point where I could say, look, this guy's going to go high in the draft, but he's not going to sign. My recommendation is that you utilize, if you're coming into the area, my recommendation is that you spend your time on Smith and Jones, and we don't worry about Richardson here. Odds are he's not going to get to us. There's makeup problems, there's signability problems. So it was a lot of fun in those departments. The organization overall, had its ups and downs. Dan did a really good job, had us in the playoffs. Shoot, I forget what it was, 3 or 5 years. As you look back now at a lot of the drafts and people we have, they've kind of gotten better over time than I think we were given credit for at the time. But things changed when Mike Elias came over, and it was a little bit different. process for sure, a little bit different way of doing things, and that led to some changes, unfortunately. But working in those scouting departments for Joe Jordan and Gary Racich was outstanding.
How much, again, obviously it's always talked about in the baseball world without having that true salary cap like other sports. How unique is that in the scouting world where, like you said, right? Like, hey, I'm recommending you go watch these two guys because this guy, yeah, he might be talented enough, but he's probably not going to be there. And if he is, like, we probably won't be able to, like, was that conversation always had really early with top prospects, or was that something that over time you just kind of end up gathering based on how they end up finishing their high school, junior college career, or they're, becoming a junior in college and being draft eligible again? Like, is that just something that kind of goes along, or is that right away when you're looking at these guys like, hey, we really need to figure out, like, are we going to actually be able to get this guy if we draft him?
It's a little bit of both. So as you're doing your evaluation, the main thing, the overarching thing when you're watching a player, you kind of decide, I have some interest in this guy, is what type of role would he fill in the major leagues? So let's say you're watching a high school shortstop, and one of the determinations is, does this guy have the arm strength, the hands, the range, the agility to stay at short? And then if the answer is yes, then you've got somebody that's a pretty interesting prospect as a high school kid that can do those things that play it short. And then the evaluation goes to the bat. And that's changed a little bit over time with guys hitting for more power, a little bit more interest in having an offensive shortstop. But if your answer is no, then you're looking at him with the idea of, okay, does he move to center? Does he move to second base? Does he move to third base? Does he have enough power? Be an everyday player at third. If you don't see him as an everyday player, does he have versatility? Which obviously in the game nowadays, versatility is a really big deal and a real positive. Where maybe 20 years ago in our industry, if a guy was going to be a utility player, that was kind of held against him. Now that's a positive. So in the process of doing that, you're kind of formulating in your mind, well, where in the draft would I be interested in this guy? And so you're possibly thinking about a high school kid, we'll say, for sake of discussion, in the third or fourth round. As you start to do some due diligence and talk to people, your antenna's kind of up to, would this player be likely, unlikely, undetermined, to sign in that draft? You start asking some questions. Nowadays, a lot of the players have agents. So early on, some of that information comes out. We do an interview process we called signabilities, where we'd sit down with the families and the players and talk to them. With the more and more players having agents, it's gone a little bit more through the agents, where you're asking them directly, hey, is this guy interested in signing? Is he dead set on his college commitment? What type of money are you looking for? And then those type of things end up coming into play sometimes for some organizations in terms of how your time is spent. For other organizations, they just want you to evaluate those players. They want the regional, the national guys, the scouting directors, they want everybody to come in and see all those players. And then they'll let the signability issues shake out, even right before the draft. A lot of times it would happen during the draft. You'd call an agent and say, hey, we're considering taking your guy in this area of the draft, and this is what we have.
Sure.
This going to work, yes or no? And that's made things a lot cleaner, a little less stressful. Going back 25 years, you're dealing with a high school family and you get a phone call right before the draft and say, hey, we're going to take Bishop here in the ninth round. Can you sign him for this amount of money? Yes or no? And you make it, you give your answer, and then then you gotta follow through. So that led for some stress sometimes, but it was also a lot of fun. The negotiations were fun, and it was a lot of fun to come to an agreement and see the excitement with kids and families that they were going to get to fulfill their dream, whether it's high school kids or college kids. And that doesn't happen as much anymore. And I think, for both the scouts and the baseball people, but also for the families, it's a little bit of a shame that you don't quite have that culmination of, okay, here it is. I just signed my first professional contract. I'm a professional baseball player now.
Yeah, I can imagine, if you didn't have if the father wasn't in minor league or major league baseball and they didn't have an older brother, I can imagine that situation for them was kind of unique, right? We were like, hey, here's what we can give you. And, there's probably not a lot of people, back then to reach out to or research of like, hey, is this what we should be getting or whatever? But like you said, I'm sure that made for anxious, but also very fun moments as well. When you talked Orioles, you talked about kind of that shakeup in, the 2019 things came to an end there for you, going through that experience. What do you remember of like the feeling of obviously you'd been in it a long time at that point, kind of getting the word that, that you're gonna be no longer with the organization there. Like what was kind of that feeling like of just being told like, this is kind of the end of the road here in Baltimore?
Well, yeah, I'd gotten a heads up phone call from a friend of mine on the East Coast who had gotten a phone call, or Midwest actually, who'd gotten a phone call earlier and said, "Hey, this had happened." So it wasn't a total surprise. It wasn't a total surprise even throughout the course of the year with, how Mike had done some things with Houston. It was a mixed bag. I was disappointed on one hand. On another hand, it felt like maybe it was time after having been someplace 15 years and to try out, that was a long run. It was uncommon, getting to be uncommon in that day and age. So to be able to set some roots down someplace else to move on to learn from some other people too. I mean, I had worked with a lot of the similar people, and I don't want to say that I couldn't learn anymore. You can always learn something for somebody, and there's a lot of experiences that led to learning. But there was some optimism about, hey, this would be an opportunity to go and get with another organization and see how they do things, possibility to move up. The people there in Baltimore were pretty entrenched, and they were also cutting back the cross checker levels, which is what kind of led to me not being renewed, as they had dropped a cross checker down into the area. My contract was up and he had a couple years remaining on his contract. So that's what I was told was the reason for the move. But it was kind of some optimism, and things just didn't work out that first year. Was bridesmaid a couple times. Or maid of honor rather than the bride on a couple jobs, and then COVID hit and kind of turned everything, the industry, upside down. At the time that I was let go, I was disappointed because I knew I'd done a good job for them, but there was also some hope, and some viewing this as an opportunity, and some of those opportunities just didn't work out.
Yeah, no doubt. And like you mentioned, obviously COVID threw a wrench in everything. But I can imagine that that summer was a complete mess, anyways. I mean, I remember I was in the Northwoods League. We actually had a short season. I mean, usually we play 72 games, and I think we played 36, or even maybe less than that, because it was like there was only a quarter of the teams playing. And I remember like we were like one of five leagues of any level in the country that was having baseball. And so could only have like 400 fans. And there was a few scouts that somehow in the area showed up once in a great while, but it was just so unique. And I remember the talent level we had was always good in the Northwoods League, but that summer it was even higher because there were kids all over wanting a chance to go somewhere to play. But yeah, obviously something that, kind of messed up a lot of different things. And then you did get a short stint back with the Mets. So getting back into that, I guess what was that? You go from one feeling of like, okay, and then COVID hits, but then, a few years later you get back in with the Mets. So, what was that chance of kind of getting back into it feel like?
Well, it came as a complete surprise, and I had interviewed with them for actually a job I guess you'd say the Midwest, Tennessee and some of those areas there in that part of the country, and finished second in that. And in February, I got a call from them asking if I wanted to come aboard late in the process as a part-time guy. And it was a surprise. I was happy to do it. I ended up in a really good situation working with Glenn Walker and Rusty McNamara, who were the area guys, and it was a lot of fun. And they had really good people there. One of the guys that I got to be close with there, Eddie Bain, was working kind of as I think he was part time, but he was labeled as part time, but he did an awful lot of cross checking and was relied on there. And he was very successful when he was the scouting director with the Angels, was responsible for drafting Mike Trout and having a draft there that was. Um, Looked at now as probably one of the best amateur drafts of all time. So getting to know Eddie a little bit more and work with him closely, it was great. That was a lot of fun working with those guys. And I didn't have, I was reporting basically to Rusty and to Glenn and helping them with their areas. So I didn't have the responsibilities that I had, with Baltimore, where I was running the area. I was really able to say, who do you need me to see? What can I do to help you? And that was really a lot of fun. It was freeing.
You're in it, but you're not like totally driven. I mean, where you're committed to it, right? Like totally in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was working with those guys and just doing everything I could to do to help them. And, whether it be running down a name of a guy they hadn't seen, whether it be, sneaking in and seeing a guy that they had seen and they had some interest, and maybe they needed to go and be someplace else, but I could go and get an extra look at somebody for them. And that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that year. It was a really good group of guys there to be working with.
No, that's awesome. I remember reading an article, this was probably 2, 3 years ago on The Athletic, of Mike Trout and his host family that he stayed with. I believe it was in Iowa, maybe Cedar Rapids, the short stint that he was there. And, it kind of hit close to home. We did a little bit of hosting with the Dock Spiders in Fond du Lac before I worked there. And, they had just talked about how all he did was eat steaks and drink Pepsi. And all those guys just talked about, when he left, everybody was grabbing cleats and his bats and everything to take as a souvenir because everybody knew that he was going to be successful. So it was a really good read. I guess kind of going back to what you started with. Obviously, you had a really unique upbringing, and being at the doctor's office and kind of having that conversation, which led from one thing to another. How do you think that is similar or dissimilar in today's world? Is it still about meeting people, or is it just about, again, nowadays, I feel like, with social media, everybody's a scout in every sport. Everyone's got all the answers, but is it really trying to get in and just show people like, hey, I'm willing to do anything for really nothing. Like, I just want the experience and I'm going to, do whatever. I'll drive to these games. I'll help in an office or whatever to get my foot in the door. Or is it really just truly about just meeting people and kind of getting out and getting to know names and possibly getting opportunities that way?
Well, I definitely think it's different with the technology nowadays. There's a lot of information available. There's a lot of people, you see on LinkedIn where people are, making their evaluations with the information that's available and videos and learning how to write reports and things. I mean, when I got hired part-time with the Mets, when Jim Woodward hired me, they're my junior year at San Diego State, that's was taught how to write reports, was given the opportunity by Jim to go in and do signabilities and participate in negotiations and things like that. That has kind of changed. The way I got into it obviously is a little bit different. The way people would get into it at that point in time is being seen at the ballpark or and saying, "Hey, I see you around. What do you do? Why am I seeing you here at all these different high school games or at these junior college games?" Nowadays, it's is driven a lot more through, the contacts higher up. I mean, one of the things my dad told me when I got hired is he said, "You have a tendency to revolve in the circles you start in." So you wanna start where you wanna be. And I think nowadays, a lot of the guys, you're going more of the intern type route. There's a lot more of those positions now available. You see a lot of those jobs posted where rather than being a bird dog like I was for Dean, jumping in the car and going and, trying to find somebody for him, it's people that are doing interns in offices and things, learning the ropes, and then going out into either an area job or staying in the office. But there's more of those type of things that are public, that are advertised than word of mouth that it used to be.
Yeah, no, that
So
makes
it's a little difficult, to because my experience was so foreign to advise when I do get people that reach out and say, "Well, how would I get in?" It's still a who you know.
Do you just tell them like go to your family doctor?
Yeah, you can tell them that, but it takes them 6 weeks to get in to see the guy.
That's true. That's true. That's a good point. Oh, that's funny. I guess, and again, I appreciate you sitting down and taking some time. And again, for me, it's like I have an idea of that world, but again, to me, it's completely foreign being a basketball guy and whatnot. So I appreciate you sharing some of the depth of what you have on just different stories and whatnot. But in terms of like day to day and like how do you get better? Like obviously you talked about subscribing to Neil's newsletter from the football side. I'm sure like scouting to me is like, again, this is why I really was excited to connect with you because I feel like scouting and recruiting, there's so much for similarities, whether it's character, athletic ability, the alpha, there's so many different things that carry over. But at the end of the day, obviously each sport has its own intricacies. But how do you like get better in terms of like whether it's scouting or just lifelong learning type stuff? Is there any books or newsletters or podcasts or things like that that you listen to or read?
Oh, that's a in term wow, in terms of podcasts or books, I really I'd have to think about that. It's continuing conversations with friends and colleagues. Um, going back over the years, hey, what did you think about Smith? Did you like Smith? Did you dislike? Why was that? What did you know about him? What insights did you have? Having those conversations with people, especially the way the game is shifting. I mean, I was very fortunate when I got started. There were still numerous old veteran scouts that were still scouting. I mean, I had the good fortune one day to find myself in Anaheim Stadium sitting next to a man named Howie Hake, who was responsible for pushing Branch Rickey to acquire Roberto Clemente from the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he was, kind enough to answer some questions. So, in the early days, it was asking questions of people that have been successful, and it's still kind of the same thing, asking guys, "Hey, man, you hit on this guy. What did you see? I didn't see that." And a lot of times it came down not so much to their physical ability, but what we call it makeup, but it's kind of short for mental makeup. All the work habits, the mental toughness, the drive, the discipline, and even some of the intangible things, and finding out, you know, what they saw, what you might have missed, staying in touch with people on what some of the changes are. But really, the evaluation still the evaluations, a lot of the data and the analytics things are still things that we looked for, you know, 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago, just in saying, instead of saying the ball jumps off the guy's bat, now you have, the data from TrackMan. It says the exit was, 105 miles an hour. So,
Right.
it can allow you to work smarter in a lot of ways. Um, Neil, the football draft, through being out and especially during COVID, really became interesting to me in terms of how those NFL guys go about evaluating, the importance that they put on positions, in terms of certain positions having more value. Even if you think a guy is going to be a starter at one position, that they view different positions as having, more value. A left tackle is going to have, you know, possibly more positional value than your starting right guard.
Right.
That's interesting. So, and just, watching lots of athletes and just kind of testing yourself, even in other sports, saying, "Hey, this guy seems like this guy has something here. Let's watch and see how this progresses." Just kind of builds the Rolodex, and especially with regard to, again, the mental makeup type of thing, and that little voice that all of us have that have done it for a long time that says, "Oh, this guy's a little different than everybody else. Let's see how this turns out."
Yeah, no doubt. I remember, and I struggle with the biggest thing with me was, you had like your set qualities, characteristics you were looking for, and I would go to, about 36 games a winter, in our season, going to high school games and a junior college game or whatever. And, sometimes it might be like, well, maybe there's something with his game, or maybe there's a little bit with his character. We were like, well, when we get him here, I can change him. Well, you find out over time real quick that you really can't change people. People don't change much. And so those are the things you look back and you're like, but like, I think what you were saying too, which is great, having those conversations, but also the amount of years you put in. I mean, if you just go back over those drafts and over those picks and the players you saw and you reflect on those, you instantly can kind of figure out what was important to you, right? And what maybe stood out or from other people, right? Like, connecting with them, like you said, like, hey, I didn't see this in that guy, but what'd you see? Sometimes it's, it doesn't have to be this, crazy altering thing that you have epiphany of like trying to figure out how to get better. Sometimes it's just that reflection of like, yep, I knew this was going to be there, but I didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal. Right. And then it blew up, or in a good way or a bad way. And so sometimes it's just kind of, I think, looking back at those things.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, you're trying to predict the future is what it comes right down to it. And when you're dealing with, 17 to 20-year-old, 22-year-old people whose nervous systems aren't fully mature yet, um, they're being put into positions that they haven't been put in. They might be going to medium fish into a smaller pond. Nowadays, it's not quite as prevalent with the higher picks because they're facing such good competition, especially, a Team USA type of thing on the travel ball that's so prevalent, the showcases. You're not running into guys that have, seen all of a sudden 94 for the first time after you signed them. So you have a little bit better idea how they may deal with adversity. But to me, that was always the number one thing I was trying to find out, especially after having made some costly mistakes, was how is this guy going to deal with adversity? When adversity strikes, who's going to be on the other end of the phone? Is it their hitting or pitching guru that's telling them, no, they're wrong. You have to listen to me. Is mom or dad going to make them out to be the victim? Is somebody going to tell them, say, hey, this is what you signed up for? You got to dig deep. This is time to, you know, tough times don't last, tough people do, all the different cliches and that sort of
Right.
thing. Especially nowadays with all the information that's available, very rarely does anybody make a mistake on physical ability. So it comes down to some of those intangible things, and it comes down to just how are they going to adjust to circumstances they've never encountered.
And
And
I,
you
and
do. you do the best you can to get as much information as possible, but at best it's an educated guess. And a lot of times you have to rely on a gut feel or some instincts. And in an environment where so much stuff is quantified nowadays, and that's the language, it can be difficult to articulate that.
No, I love that. That's perfectly said. And I just think of like, which again can happen to the junior college kids and the 3-year college kids or 4-year college kids, or some days 5-year college kids now or 6 years, however
Right.
long they're in school. But I can imagine even for the high school kids, when you're an alpha and you're going to be a top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 round pick. I mean, it's tough to find that adversity, right? Where they're the guy and they don't see a lot of struggles probably. Like, how can I figure out when things go wrong or when they hit a wall or whatever that's going to be in the minor leagues or on their way to their path up the ranks, like how that's going to make them, right? Like you said, that's the toughest part. The ability thing, I think, is the easy thing to figure out.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's always easy, but it's the easier of the two that you have to figure out. And, the old time guy used to say baseball is a game of adjustments. And you're really looking to see who might be able to make an adjustment. And as a scout, you really have to be able to make adjustments, whether it be on your day-to-day schedule, whether that be, how you're evaluating somebody where, a particular mechanic or a particular thing might not be your personal preference. I mean, that's early on in my career. That was something that I missed on a couple of guys because I felt like, okay, this guy's swing isn't going to be conducive to having success at higher levels, despite the fact that, they were showing timing and the ability to make consistent hard contact and do all the things that you want. And they continue to do it. And, the ability to adjust is really important, especially, as the game changes is so as an evaluator, you're looking for, very few, players like King Griffey Jr., where you're going to go number one overall and be in the major leagues at 19. There's going to be some adjustments that need to be made, and hopefully they're minor rather than major. And hopefully, there aren't any landmines that you weren't able to uncover. That was always the nightmare scenario that you worried about, is that something would pop up that, you just didn't uncover. But those sort of things are really, I think they're still really valuable even today with the amount of information, with the amount of looks, the amount of data. College games on Synergy being on video, where you can access a lot of those things and utilize that extra information. There's still some areas where you can, I think, glean a little bit of insight that gives you a little bit over advantage over when somebody is just, going off of their performance they're seeing, or, the information that's available. Somebody has an illness in the family that's affecting the kid, or maybe there's a new hitting coach that wants them to do something. I mean, I had a young man one time who was playing for, a very well-known coach, and when I was speaking to him about his approach to hitting, he says, "Well, this is what I do, but that's not really what works best for me." I said, "Really? Well, why are you doing that then?" He says, "Well, look who I'm playing for." He goes, "What am I gonna do? I'm gonna say to this guy that played in the major leagues, 'No, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm gonna do it my way.'" He says, "So I'm doing the best I can." And he says, "When I get out to the minor leagues, I'm gonna do what I need to do to move up the ladder." And he ended up, playing in the major leagues and having a 5 or 6 year career. Without sitting down and talking to that particular individual, you would, from the stand, say, "Well, geez, this what he's doing mechanically and his approach at the plate, that's why is he doing that? That's not going to work." And then with some investigation, you find out, okay, there's some maturity to what that particular player was doing.
Yeah. Wow. That's a crazy conversation there. Interesting. Well, I would be remiss. I know I've almost taken an hour of your time here. I apologize.
No, that's
Um,
okay. Enjoy talking out.
yeah, it's been great. But I'd be remiss if I did not ask who was the best player you feel like you saw, and we can go high school level if you want, or we can just go overall. Who was the best prospect you saw that, years later obviously became, a star at the MLB level? Like who was the best that you're like when you saw them right away, you're like, oh my gosh, like this guy's legit.
Alex Rodriguez is the best amateur I ever saw. And everybody knew who Alex Rodriguez was. The game that I was at Cal State Fullerton, his team was out here for a large national tournament. I mean, it was just, he just did everything.
Sure.
And, checked all the boxes. And, that was a relatively easy one, for in terms of the evaluation, then it comes down to, you know, you just have to be fortunate enough to be picking at the top of the draft like that. But, those are fun conversations we have with peers and colleagues, friends in the stands. Did you see so and so? Did you see this? Yeah, man, that guy hit a ball over the scoreboard here at Blair Field. I haven't seen that. Oh yeah, I saw Todd Hilton do that one night here 25 years ago. Those sorts of conversations are happen a lot, and they're one of the really fun parts of the job.
There was I told you on the phone last night that I'd interned with the Timber Rattlers in '07, and they were low A affiliate of the Mariners at that time. And there's a story back in '95 when they built the new stadium in Appleton, when they were the Mariners affiliate. And some reason the Mariners were doing like this tour of all the minor league ballparks. I don't remember all that went with it, but obviously A Rod at that time was up with them because he
Yeah.
was in Appleton for a short stint, but he was up with them. Griffey obviously was there, and they decided to have this home run derby. It rained. They had all these fans that came out, and obviously the players and Lou Piniella did not want them obviously playing on a wet field. So they did a home run derby, and there's actually a video of this. I don't know if it's on YouTube or it's buried on a page somewhere, but they did a home run derby, and Griffey's getting up there, and he's actually swinging and missing, on some of these just lob pitches, and people are razzing him and whatever. Well, a Timber Rattler actually ends up winning it, and the guy's name is David Arias. And years later, David Arias becomes David Ortiz. So it's a very interesting. Like I said, there's some video, and Ortiz and these guys at the time, they got pictures of Griffey and Rodriguez, and they're just like, wow, like this guy's, Ortiz is just smashing them out of the park. And at that time, they're like, who the heck is this guy? So there's just so many stories like that. I feel like with minor and major league baseball, where it's like 1 minute, who is this guy, and then all of a sudden he becomes a household name for everybody to know. So that's the fun part of it, though.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of the things that leads to a lot of stories, a lot of talking about guys you saw, you know, in high school and college, in minor league coverage. I saw Vladimir Guerrero Jr. when he was 18 years old and in the South Atlantic League, and then now his son's starring for the Blue Jays in the World Series. It's I think that's one of the things that is unique to sports and maybe even baseball because we evaluate so many kids in high school and evaluate international even at younger ages is you see some of those players. Obviously football, you see kids in high school, but you're not drafting kids out of high school. I think some baseball lends itself a little bit more towards that than maybe even some of the other sports. Now, whether it be a guy that's a late bloomer or just somebody like a King Griffey Jr. or Alex Rodriguez, it's just a generational talent that just stands out so severely that you're sitting there knowing, yeah, I'm going to be talking about this guy, 30 years down the road saying, yeah, I got a chance to see this guy when he was in high school.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, Mark, like I said, basically an hour here. I appreciate you taking some time diving in. This has been great. So really appreciate you obviously connecting on LinkedIn, taking the opportunity to sit down, chat last night, and then obviously sit down tonight. And yeah, really appreciate this podcast. I think there's a lot of great nuggets for people out there of all sports. Again, like I said, I think scouting and recruiting kind of go hand in hand, and just kind of what people can look for. So thanks for sitting down tonight.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Enjoyed it.